Last night during the State of the Union address, something slipped, not from the podium, but from the frustration behind it. The U.S. trade chief made it clear. Canada will only get a deal if it accepts higher tariffs. In other words, cave, pay more, submit. And that tells you everything about where this administration stands right now. Because when a superpower starts saying, you only get a deal if you surrender first, that's not confidence. That's pressure. That's desperation. But here's the part Washington did not anticipate. Mark Carney is not folding. He is not panicking. He is not rushing to negotiate from weakness. Instead, he's expanding. Let's be clear about what just happened. The U.S. Trade Representative publicly suggested Canada must accept higher tariffs to move forward. That's not how balanced trade negotiations work. That's leverage talk. But leverage only works if the other side needs you more than you need them. And that's where this calculation may be wrong. Because instead of pleading for access to the U.S. market, Carney has been doing something far more strategic. He's diversifying away from it. This isn't rhetoric. This is policy. This is long-term repositioning. And that is precisely what is making Washington nervous. When we go to other countries and we make a deal with them, the other countries agree that we can have a tariff on them, a protective tariff to protect our industries as we try to break, and they open their markets to us. If Canada wants to agree that we can have some level of higher tariff on them while they open up their markets to us in things like dairy and other things, then that's a helpful conversation. We have very open lines of communication. We'll keep talking. Donald Trump thrives on leverage. His negotiation style has always relied on asymmetry. Pressure the smaller partner, force concessions, dominate the terms. But that strategy collapses if the smaller partner builds alternatives. If Canada redirects exports, if Canada can secure markets elsewhere, if Canada can absorb the shock, then tariff threats become blunt instruments. And blunt instruments don't scare disciplined leaders. That is why we're hearing sharper rhetoric from U.S. officials. Not because they're winning, but because the pressure isn't working the way they expected. Those conversations are continuing to advance. But my job as Minister of International Trade is to look beyond North America. Trade diversification, our goal of hitting $300 billion of non-U.S. exports, additional non-U.S. exports, is very important. And that's why this trade trip that's coming up is very important in terms of unlocking opportunities for workers. Now, this is where the story shifts from trade policy to leadership. Because look around the world. When Washington applied tariff pressure, what happened? Some leaders rushed to secure exemptions. Some accepted temporary adjustments. Some quietly absorbed the tariffs. Some made symbolic statements and then moved on. But Carney didn't absorb. He didn't stall. He didn't posture. He acted. And that distinction is everything. While others reacted to Trump's pressure cycle, Carney broke the cycle entirely. Instead of arguing about the tariff percentage, he changed the equation. He refused to negotiate from fear. He refused to validate the premise that Canada must accept higher tariffs just to sit at the table. And that's why this moment is bigger than Canada. Because in a world where global leaders have often recalibrated themselves around Washington's volatility, Carney recalibrated Canada away from it. That is not defiance for the sake of defiance. That is structural independence. And that's what makes this so uncomfortable for the U.S. administration. Because when pressure doesn't produce panic, when threats don't produce concessions, when a mid-sized economy doesn't blink, it sends a signal globally. It tells other nations that alignment with the U.S. is no longer the only growth path. It tells markets that Canada is willing to withstand turbulence for long-term leverage. It tells Washington that the old formula, escalate, intimidate, extract, may not work this time. And here's the reality. This is not loud resistance. This is disciplined resistance. Carney didn't respond with outrage. He responded with architecture. He didn't fire back with headlines. He quietly built alternatives. He didn't say, we won't cave. He built a world where he doesn't have to. And that is far more powerful. Because leadership in moments like this isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about who builds the most options. And right now, Carney is building options. While others adjusted to Washington's gravity, Canada started adjusting its orbit. That's why this isn't just another tariff story. This is a repositioning story. And in geopolitics, repositioning changes leverage. Carney's upcoming trade mission is not routine diplomacy. India represents massive consumer expansion. Japan represents high-tech industrial partnerships. Australia represents resource and security alignment. This is a triangulation strategy across Indo-Pacific democracies. And it sends a message. Canada's future growth will not hinge on a single market, not even the United States. And that is the structural shift that changes the balance. When a U.S. trade official says, accept higher tariffs or no deal, it signals something important. They want movement. They want concessions. They want validation of their tariff structure. But if Canada refuses, if Canada expands elsewhere, if Canada absorbs short-term pain for long-term independence, then the entire pressure model weakens. That's the strategic chessboard right now. And it's not just Trump who is facing the pressure. Ironically, the trade conflict may have accelerated Canada's global positioning. It forced diversification. It accelerated non-US trade agreements. It deepened Indo-Pacific alignment. It strengthened EU relationships. It hardened negotiation posture. And in politics, adversity often forces clarity. Canada now knows it must be economically flexible. That clarity is power. Those conversations will continue to happen. My job as the International Trade Minister is to focus on economic opportunities. Because at a time where we need to make sure we have economic resiliency with what's happening with our southern neighbor, we promised Canadians that we will diversify, and what we're doing is leading to results. You talk about our trip to China unlocking $7 billion of agriculture opportunities in seafood, in beef, in canola. You talk about Prime Minister Carney's visit to the Gulf bringing back a $70 billion commitment to build major projects across Canada, our commitment to the EU, and our defense procurement opportunities. So this is what it's all about. At the end of the day, it's about workers and unlocking opportunities. This is not a story about pride. It's not about ego. It's not about shouting matches. It's about structural repositioning. The US says accept higher tariffs. Carney says we'll expand elsewhere. The US says this is the only path to a deal. Canada says we have options. And in global trade, options are strength. The real question is no longer whether Canada caves. The real question is whether Washington adjusts to a Canada that is no longer dependent. Because this isn't just a trade dispute anymore. It's a shift in economic alignment. And the consequences of that shift will define North America for the next decade. Now, let me expand on what this really means for the future of middle power strategy in a multipolar world, and why Canada's approach represents a potential template that other countries are watching very carefully. Because what we're witnessing isn't just about Canada. It's about whether mid-sized economies can successfully assert independence from great power coercion in the 21st century. For decades, the conventional wisdom in international relations has been that middle powers, countries that are significant but not dominant, must carefully manage their relationships with superpowers through accommodation, hedging, and strategic ambiguity. The assumption was that direct confrontation with a country the size and power of the United States was economically suicidal and politically futile. This assumption was built on the Cold War structure of the international system, where middle powers like Canada had to choose alignment with one of two superpowers, the United States or the Soviet Union. And once that choice was made, subordination to that superpower's preferences was the price of security and prosperity. But the world has changed fundamentally. The bipolar Cold War system gave way to a unipolar American-dominated moment in the 1990s and early 2000s, which is now giving way to something genuinely multipolar. China is a major economy and technological power. The European Union, despite its internal challenges, represents a massive integrated market. India is rising. The Indo-Pacific is economically dynamic. Regional powers like Brazil, Indonesia, and Turkey have significant leverage in their own neighborhoods. This structural change in the global system creates opportunities for middle powers that simply didn't exist a generation ago. Because when there are multiple major economies competing for trade relationships, investment opportunities, and strategic partnerships, middle powers gain negotiating leverage. They can diversify. They can play major powers off against each other. Not through duplicity, but through genuine economic integration across multiple relationships. This is exactly what Carney is doing, and it's why his strategy is being watched so closely by countries in similar positions. Canada is not trying to escape economic interdependence with the United States. That's impossible given geography, history, and the depth of existing integration. But Canada is reducing the asymmetry of that interdependence by building out alternative relationships that create options. The $7 billion in agricultural opportunities unlocked through engagement with China is significant not just for its dollar value, but for what it represents. Canadian farmers and food producers are no longer exclusively dependent on U.S. market access. If Washington threatens Canadian agricultural exports, Canadian producers have alternative buyers already cultivated. The $70 billion in commitments from Gulf states for infrastructure projects in Canada is significant not just for the investment itself, but because it represents capital flows into Canada that don't originate in New York or Los Angeles. If U.S. investors become skittish about Canada because of political tensions, there are alternative sources of capital ready to step in. The defense procurement relationships with the EU are significant because they reduce Canada's dependence on American defense contractors and create alternative supply chains for military equipment. This isn't about Canada leaving NATO or abandoning continental defense cooperation with the United States. It's about ensuring Canada has options if American reliability becomes questionable. Each of these relationships individually might seem like standard trade diplomacy, but taken together, they represent a systematic effort to build structural alternatives to U.S. market dependence. And that's what changes the leverage dynamic. When the U.S. Trade Representative says accept higher tariffs or no deal, that statement carries weight only if no deal is catastrophic for Canada. But if no deal means Canada redirects trade flows to India, Japan, Australia, China, the EU, and the Gulf states, markets that Canada has been systematically cultivating, then no deal becomes a manageable scenario rather than an existential threat. This is what Washington finds so uncomfortable, because the entire negotiating posture of the Trump administration toward allies has been built on the assumption of dependence. The assumption that allies need the United States more than the United States needs them, and therefore pressure will inevitably produce concessions. But that assumption only holds if the ally in question has no alternatives. And Carney is methodically disproving that assumption by building alternatives in real time. The strategic genius of this approach is that it doesn't require matching American power. Canada will never have an economy the size of the United States. Canada will never have a military as powerful. Canada will never have the same geopolitical reach. But Canada doesn't need any of those things to successfully resist American economic coercion. What Canada needs is enough economic diversification to make American pressure bearable, and enough alternative relationships to make American threats less credible. And that's exactly what's being built. This is asymmetric strategy, not matching the opponent's strength, but undermining the basis of that strength. The basis of American leverage over Canada is economic dependence. Reduce that dependence, and the leverage evaporates. The implications of this strategy extend far beyond Canada. Every middle power that has felt pressure from Washington over the past several years is watching this unfold. South Korea is watching. Mexico is watching. The ASEAN countries are watching. European allies are watching. And they're all asking themselves the same question. If Canada can successfully diversify away from U.S. economic dependence, can we? The answer for many of them is likely yes, especially given the multipolar structure of the current global economy. There are alternative markets. There are alternative sources of capital. There are alternative technology partners. There are alternative security relationships. These alternatives have costs. Building new relationships takes time, effort, and resources. But the costs of remaining exclusively dependent on an increasingly unreliable hegemon are also substantial. This is why the U.S. response to Carney's strategy is so telling. The demand that Canada accept higher tariffs as a precondition for negotiation is not the language of confidence. It's the language of someone who recognizes their leverage is slipping and is trying to salvage it through escalation. But escalation without a credible threat is just noise. And if Canada can weather the escalation, if Canadian businesses can redirect exports, if Canadian consumers can absorb higher prices in the short term, if Canadian voters support the government through the turbulence, then the escalation fails. And failure teaches a lesson not just to Canada, but to every country watching. The lesson is, independence is possible. Diversification works. Middle powers don't have to accept subordination to great power preferences. There are alternatives. This represents a genuine shift in how international politics might work in the multipolar 21st century. Not a return to great power competition where middle powers are pawns, but an environment where middle powers have agency, where they can pursue their own interests, where they can resist coercion through strategic diversification rather than direct confrontation. That's what makes this moment significant beyond the immediate trade dispute. Carney isn't just negotiating tariff rates. He's demonstrating a model of middle power strategy that could fundamentally change how smaller countries engage with larger ones. And if that model succeeds, if Canada emerges from this confrontation with greater independence rather than less, it will inspire similar strategies worldwide. The United States could respond to this shift by trying to force countries back into dependent relationships through even more coercive measures. But coercion is expensive, unpredictable, and alienates allies. Or the United States could adjust to a world where partnerships are genuinely reciprocal, where allies have options, where maintaining relationships requires respecting sovereignty rather than demanding subordination. The choice is ultimately Washington's. But Canada is no longer waiting for that choice to be made. Canada is building a world where the choice matters less because the alternatives are real. If you want analysis that goes beyond headlines and breaks down the real geopolitical chess moves shaping Canada's future, this is your channel. Subscribe to Newsix Brief, turn on notifications, and stay ahead of every shift in this evolving trade battle. And now I want to hear from you. Is Carney's diversification strategy the right long-term move? Or should Canada prioritize repairing ties with Washington first? Let me know in the comments.